So yeah, I just walked through a graduation ceremony for my bachelor's degree. I still have a little bit of work to do and some incompletes before I actually get my sheepskin, actually get my diploma. But that'll be coming soon. During the last week of school, one of my classes had an assignment where we were to go observe an area with our group. The group's 3 or 4 people. Mine was grouped with 2 other people. Originally we were supposed to go to a livestock auction. That's what we had been assigned. But scheduling conflicts, giving us limited time, they told us to pick a place. The other guy in the group came up with going to a rest area. So the project was to sit there for an hour and observe. Use all your senses and find some way to report what you observed. My idea was inspired by my daughter, who has been watching Fraggle Rock a lot recently. For those of you who don't know, Fraggle Rock was a kids show that came out in the probably mid to late 80s, I believe. It was on for about 5 years. It was a Jim Henson's production, used little furry Muppets that lived in a cave underground. And our world was considered outer space. And one of the Fraggles went out and traveled through outer space and observed us. And his name was Uncle Matt. And every week he would send a postcard back to his nephew. And his nephew would have to come up to the beginning of outer space, basically collect the postcard, bring it back. So every week you'd have these postcards from Uncle Matt on this segment. And he considered us silly people, was what he called us. And basically drew strange conclusions about things that we did as humans, as these silly creatures. And if you try and eliminate all cultural knowledge that you have of our world and look at things in a different way, you may come up with the same conclusions for some things that Matt did. And it became very humorous. So my idea was to do the same kind of thing and do a postcards from Uncle Matt. Wanted to show you all what we came up with. Obviously it wasn't a film class and my editing skills are still pretty bad. So it was putting a lot together that was kind of detailed. So the editing is still bad, but I still wanted to show y'all.
Today I examined an area the silly creatures call a rest area. At first I thought it was a place for them to rest, but then I realized it must be a place for these shiny creatures to rest. Some of the shiny creatures are big, some of them are small. They have many different shapes and colors and sizes. They have quite a bit of diversity. Silly creatures seem to like getting inside of these shiny creatures. Apparently it makes them go much faster. There are all different types of these shiny creatures. Some are really shiny, some are more boxy and very, very large. They hold lots of the silly creatures. This doesn't always seem that comfortable for the silly creatures, as many of them seem to have trouble when they get out. I also notice the silly creatures when they drive up sometimes seem to have to help the shiny creatures to rest. They will open up different orifices of the shiny creature and give them more ways in which to breathe. Some of the big shiny creatures also have things attached to them as they move around really fast. These appear to be mobile caves. I wasn't quite sure what these mobile caves were used for, but it appears that most of the silly creatures that get inside of the shiny creatures that carry around these big caves seem to have to be larger in size. I also noticed a couple of the silly creatures that were affected by a type of parasite. This parasite I've heard referred to as Bluetooth. Apparently the Bluetooth parasite doesn't seem to have too much effect on the silly creatures, except from time to time it makes them talk to themselves. I also noticed something very unusual. Some of the silly creatures must have trouble getting around, or else have trouble and need to be controlled. Little furry creatures appear to control and help to move some of the silly creatures by dragging them around on long pieces of rope. I also noticed that the female of the species seems to require 2 of the little furry creatures to help control them, while the males only require 1. It appears the males must be easier to control. Some of the silly creatures also seemed to be examining some rectangular creatures. It took a while for some of the silly creatures to try and figure out how to communicate with the rectangular creatures. These seem to be having a lot of trouble. The one that's bobbling back and forth reminds me of a type of creature that I have once heard identified as a manager. Managers seem to bobble back and forth, but never really do anything useful, except annoy the ones that do real work. Some of the silly creatures seem to know exactly how to communicate with the rectangular creatures. It appears that they feed them little shiny things, and once they fed them enough, the rectangular creatures, in a symbiotic gesture, give the silly creatures a container that has something in it that the silly creatures really appear to enjoy. Here we see a silly creature at something that looks like a little tiny Fraggle pond, but it's very odd. Water shoots up out of it. Apparently the silly creatures from time to time have trouble with their lips, and need to have their lips cleaned. It's strange that they don't just clean their whole body in a Fraggle pond like we do. Silly creatures also seem to have a lot of explorers, because their maps are posted up for everyone to see. I also found winged creatures that come around behind the silly creatures and clean up all their mess. They must not be content with the mess that the silly creatures leave behind, and like to leave things in a more natural state. Many times the ways of these silly creatures seems really hard to understand, but I shall continue to explore and try and find out more about their ways.